Oh, well, not looking good for the Somalis, the Islamist Somalis in Minnesota. Let's see what's happening.
The hearing on the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform will come to order. I want to welcome everyone here today. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. I now recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Good morning. Today, the House Oversight Committee is holding its first hearing on the massive fraud in Minnesota's social services program. Minnesota's social services, which are funded by you, the American taxpayer, are being ripped off. The most vulnerable are suffering as a result. Federal prosecutors estimate that these criminals have stolen at least $9 billion. The fraudsters, many of whom are from Minnesota's Somali community, have stolen from programs meant to feed needy kids, provide services to autistic children, house low-income and disabled Americans, and provide health care to vulnerable Medicaid recipients. Fraudsters like these take millions to enrich themselves while providing nothing, overstating or outright faking the services. How many children have gone hungry because fraudsters stole money that was intended to provide them with food? How many autistic children were denied services because fraudsters instead sent this money overseas? How many low-income seniors, people with disabilities, or those with mental illnesses were denied access to housing because fraudsters drained resources and pocketed the money for themselves? The breadth and depth of this fraud is breathtaking, and I fear that this is just the tip of the iceberg. The U.S. Department of Justice is already investigating another Minnesota service program after a disabled man battling drug addiction under the care of a fraudulent full-time provider died because of neglect. Governor Tim Walz, Attorney General Keith Ellison, and Minnesota's Democrat leadership have either been asleep at the wheel or complicit in these crimes. How could they allow this massive fraud to go on for years? This is why we're here today. We must expose this theft of taxpayer dollars and hold everybody accountable who let it happen. Today, we're joined by witnesses from Minnesota State House of Representatives who have been fighting this fight for years. These legislators are on the front lines, uncovering fraud in Minnesota's social services programs day in and day out and trying to get their state agencies to fix it. Thank you all for what you're doing to uncover the truth.
I think everyone on both sides of the aisle can agree that fraud is a threat at every level of government, in every private sector business, and to every single American. Fraud exists everywhere. I
would like to now welcome our witnesses here today. First, we have Kristen Robbins, Chairwoman of the Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Policy Committee and Representative for District 37A in the Minnesota House of Representatives. Welcome. Next, we have Walter Hudson, a member of the Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Policy Committee and Representative for Minnesota's District 30A. Next, we have Marion Rarick, a member of Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Policy Committee and Representative for District 29B in Minnesota. Lastly, we have Brendan Ballou, a former special counsel at the Department of Justice. So thank you all for joining us, and we look very forward to your testimony today. This is an issue the American people are very interested in. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, the witnesses will please stand and raise their right hand. As Representative Robbins for her opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members. Thank you for inviting us to testify. As chair of the Fraud Prevention Committee in Minnesota, I've been working to uncover the massive fraud under Tim Walz, propose solutions, and hold state agencies accountable. Today, I will highlight the scale of the problem, outline the work our committee is doing to fight the fraud, and provide a roadmap for other states on how to detect and stop fraud. Minnesota is one of the highest tax states in the nation, and hardworking Minnesotans have been told that they don't pay their fair share for years. In truth, Minnesotans pay much more in taxes than in other states, and when they pay their taxes, they expect that their money is going to things that help our communities: roads, schools, healthcare, and law enforcement. They do not want their tax dollars absconded by criminals to buy resorts and apartment buildings in Kenya, property in Turkey, and luxury homes and cars in the U.S. Tim Walz and his administration have willfully turned a blind eye to crime in the face of countless whistleblower and auditor reports, as well as stories by local investigative journalists and the Center of the American Experiment. These are actual crimes that must be punished. They are crimes against our moral values and erode trust in government. The time for accountability and justice is here. First, we are unearthing staggering amounts of fraud in Minnesota. As far back as 2014, there were credible whistleblower allegations of millions in daycare fraud. Instead of shutting it down, the state minimized whistleblower reports and allowed fraud to grow. Unfortunately, childcare fraud was just the tip of the iceberg. Since 2019, Tim Walz and Minnesota Democrats have allowed fraud to absolutely explode in Minnesota. There's been more than $300 million in the Feeding Our Future child nutrition program scandal, and the Feeding Our Future prosecutions revealed that as many as half of those indicted also ran other Medicaid-funded programs. Yet despite this being known back in 2023, Tim Walz and his agencies have done nothing to stop those defendants from getting additional state money. We have now found fraud in multiple Medicaid programs, including autism centers, sober homes, non-emergency medical transportation, integrated community supports, and housing stabilization. Just last month, our committee held a hearing on credible allegations of fraud in 2 new areas: adult day services and assisted living. First U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson, the leading prosecutor in these cases from the Biden administration and the Trump administration, says the fraud could be an astronomical $9 billion. In the face of mounting reports and literal criminal indictments and convictions, the Walz administration has repeatedly and publicly denied or downplayed the fraud. Just last January, the commissioner of DHS, Jody Harpstead, who'd been on the job for 5.5 years, said, "There's a lot more rumors of fraud than there is actual fraud." You cannot make this up. The Walz administration has been gaslighting Minnesotans on the scale of the fraud problem for years. In response, when Republicans took control or ended Democrat control of the Minnesota House last year, we created the Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Committee. Since last February, we have held 15 hearings where we have grilled officials, exposed new areas of fraud, and repeatedly flagged failures in internal controls. I authored a new law to expand whistleblower protection, and we created a portal, mnfraud.com, resulting in a surge of new whistleblower reports that our amazing staff is still working through. Under the leadership of our Vice Chair, Patty Anderson, we passed a bipartisan bill in the Senate to create an independent Office of Inspector General. When it got to the House, Democrats killed it because the DHS commissioner testified against it. The Tim Walz administration has utterly failed to protect Minnesota taxpayers and vulnerable citizens, ignoring years of credible reports and retaliating against those who spoke up, often by claiming they were racist or Islamophobic. Tim Walz and the Democrats have repeatedly protected their political base at the expense of all Minnesotans. Other states should learn from the failures of the Walz administration, so I'll give you a quick roadmap on how to find and stop fraud. First, culture matters. Fraud flourishes when leaders ignore it and criminals see they can get away with it. Second, fraud flourishes when basic internal controls are not followed. This is not complicated. Third, you have to look at the interconnections of relationships in businesses in multiple program areas in Medicaid. It's a huge red flag that has been ignored in our state. Finally, it is important to say what is true and to stand up against fake allegations of racism or Islamophobia. Crime is crime, no matter who is committing it. It is true that the majority of the fraud in Minnesota has taken place in the Somali community. And it is also true that some of our best whistleblowers are from the Somali community. Democrats refuse to acknowledge this truth, and that has enabled criminals to steal billions and hurt our vulnerable citizens. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to share the lessons from Minnesota.
Chairman, ranking member, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today for the record. I am Minnesota State Representative Walter Hudson, a second-term member who sits on our House Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Committee. The recent national conversation about fraud in Minnesota has been fraught with distractions, diverting from critical concerns regarding process, policy, and oversight to sideshow concerns about personalities and partisan politics. My role here today is to cut through all of that and provide you with a clear picture of a culture which has developed over many years around the several generous benefit programs which Minnesota provides to our residents. Well-documented oversight failures have led to a lack of program integrity, creating incentives for people to monetize programs beyond their legislative intent, to turn benefits into business. Contrary to the claim just made by the ranking member that there is no evidence of this fraud, attached to my written testimony, you will find a document which collates several reports made over the past 15 years by Minnesota's nonpartisan Office of Legislative Auditor, along with transcripts of each of our hearings from the Fraud Committee, where we heard directly from staff and leaders within the state agencies which administer these programs. Here's what that record indicates. Within the state of Minnesota, government oversight has been unable to keep up with program expansion due to a combination of factors. 1, rapid expansion of funding and provider participation. 2, payment systems that prioritize access and speed. 3, verification mechanisms that occur after funds are distributed. 4, oversight capacity that does not scale with spending. And 5, diffuse accountability across agencies and contractors. This combination of factors has fostered a booming new sector of the economy that relies upon the continuation of and expansion of government programs to fuel private sector profits. I want to be clear. Even when the law is being followed precisely by every jot and tittle, Incentives still exist to abuse these programs and waste taxpayer dollars by diverting funding to profit centers rather than providing a safety net for those in temporary need. Now, criminal fraud is rampant. Deputy U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson, serving the District of Minnesota, has said that he could keep 1,000 prosecutors busy. But he's limited to a mere 25, only 5 of which are tasked with building fraud cases. He estimates that the total amount of criminal fraud over 5 years may reach $9 billion, which is fully 1/2 of the money that has been directed to these programs by the state. While Governor Tim Walz and other stakeholders dispute that assessment, the point I wish to emphasize is this. Whatever the actual number is, the full scope of the problem is not just criminal fraud, but a culture of profiting from government programs in perpetuity, not as a safety net, but as an industry. I've personally met and had discussions with folks who identify themselves as consultants for multiple entities accepting government benefits. They have made a career out of showing people how to leverage the gaps in government oversight to maximize benefit payments. Now, such conduct may not actually break the law, and that's the point. We have a system whereby an entire industry can operate under the color of law, raking in tremendous profits for individuals, all while having no incentive to save the taxpayer money or lift legitimate beneficiaries out of need. Instead, as the market for funneling benefits into businesses increases, so too does the perceived need for benevolent services. If nothing changes, if oversight is not tightened, if incentives are not changed, spending on these programs will only continue to increase with no commensurate increase in either public good or public confidence in our governing institutions. Thank you for the opportunity to submit a statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members. For the record, my name is Marion Rurick, and I am currently serving in the Minnesota House of Representatives in House District 29B. I am a member on the Minnesota House Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Committee, which was recently formed in January of 25. I was first asked to serve on the committee on January 4th, and soon after, the 5 Republican members began to meet. During one of those discussions, I was asked to reach out to the Department of Human Services whistleblowers on X, now called Minnesota Staff Fraud Reporting Commentary. I had been following them in the previous year. I reached out through a direct tweet on X on January 16th, and the very same day I got a response back that yes, they would be willing to speak to the Fraud Prevention Committee. Since that first contact, Chair Robbins and I and Representative Hudson have had multiple conference calls with them, and we have had one in-person meeting. At that meeting, they were both former and current employees. I've continued to message with them very often, sometimes daily, and their collective message has been completely consistent. Instead of focusing on fraudsters, DHS leadership instead focused its surveillance on employees. Since then, their expressed fear of retaliation has intensified under an avalanche of fraud in Minnesota. Their numbers have grown from 480 DHS employees, both current and former, to over 1,000 across multiple state agencies. They have told me repeatedly how grateful they are to the House Fraud Prevention Committee for focusing our attention on fraud in the state programs, using their inside information while keeping them completely protected. They have explained that they live in a constant state of fear of retaliation. One only has to look at what happened to Faye Bernstein to understand why. In a very recent Newsweek article dated December 13th of 25, Ms. Bernstein, a former compliance specialist, stated, Minnesota DHS functions in the opposite manner as you would think. Employees who suggest improvements or, heaven forbid, report fraud then face significant retaliation. The messenger is shot. In 2019, Bernstein said she alerted Minnesota DHS officials to sloppy contracting practices that were not legally compliant. But it's not what most people would even consider fraud. She says she was later escorted out of the building, faced lengthy investigation, got trespassed from all DHS owned and leased properties, and received an involuntary transfer to another state agency. So she says, so today if someone asks me, should I report fraud within DHS? I say, no, no, no. It is career suicide plus a whole lot more. So let's talk about that plus a whole lot more. In our face-to-face meetings with a group of whistleblowers, they revealed that retaliation now includes threats of being fired with cause, which means you do not get unemployment insurance in the state of Minnesota, being blacklisted from all state agencies, and I would note most likely our largest counties as well, which are Democrat-run. And then there was a veiled threat of the use of military intelligence against them. They later informed me that it was discovered that in some targeted employees or suspected whistleblowers' personnel files were pictures of their homes and their cars. They also described that supervisors asked them questions about their families that to them felt like a threat. One example was, "We need to know where your kids go to school and where their bus stops are." I will also note that whistleblowers we spoke to described many times that DHS used surveillance programs to surveil employees' emails and chats and other communications, looking for keywords like fraud, double billing, underspending, and overpayments. One example that the whistleblowers let me know about Lieutenant Governor Flanagan. April 12th, 2024. Flanagan comes to a DHS Health and Human Services Equity Conference at the Heritage Center in Brooklyn Center. On stage, Flanagan acknowledges the X account and the fraud concerns it raised and publicly denounced the X users and called them weirdos and losers sitting in their mother's basement. This was in a public setting with hundreds of participants and elicited gasps among the crowd. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr.
Thank you. My name is Brennan Ballou. I'm a former federal prosecutor and a native Minnesotan. Like all Minnesotans, like all Americans who have heard this story, I am deeply distressed by the fraud on the state's social service programs. Most notably, in 2022, the Department of Justice indicted 47 people for stealing an estimated $246 million in funds meant to feed children during the COVID-19 pandemic. As late as 2025, 78 people have been indicted as part of the scheme, and 56 have pleaded guilty. More recently, the department has charged over a dozen people for stealing $14 million from a program meant for children with autism, and millions more from a program meant to help disabled Minnesotans maintain stable housing. This is heartbreaking for several reasons. At the most basic level, money meant for the neediest among us, the hungry, the disabled, the destitute, was stolen. I fear that skepticism of Minnesota's social safety net, one of the things that makes the state great, will grow, and it will be harder to fund these programs in the future. And I fear that the actions of a few people will be used to demonize an entire population of Somali and East African Minnesotans who overwhelmingly have made the state more vibrant, more diverse, and more prosperous. I also fear the selective interest in fraud in America, because at the same time that these crimes are rightly being investigated by state and federal authorities, the larger infrastructure for prosecuting fraud and white-collar crime is being dismantled. Let me give you a few examples. In February 2025, the Department of Justice paused enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits foreign bribery and criminal violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which, as the name suggests, prohibits acting as a secret agent of a foreign power. Between February and April of last year, the department disbanded its Klepto Capture Task Force, which enforced sanctions against Russian oligarchs, and the National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team. And last year, the department forced out most of the lawyers of the Public Integrity Section, which prosecutes crimes by government officials, announced plans to dismantle the Tax Division, which prosecutes tax evasion, and shuttered the FBI task force that investigated congressional misconduct. More than just dismantling infrastructure for pursuing violations of the law, the government is, for favored defendants, appearing to enable it. In 2024, the Justice Department indicted Andrew Wiederhorn, the CEO of a casual fast food chain, for allegedly stealing $47 million from his own company. After his business donated $100,000 to the Trump inaugural committee, his case was dropped, and the line-level prosecutor on his case was fired. In 2021, the department sued Boeing for deceiving the government about the software that caused 2 plane crashes, killing 346 people. After donating $1 million to the inaugural committee, Boeing negotiated a favorable deferred prosecution agreement that the judge overseeing the case said, quote, fails to secure the necessary accountability to ensure the safety of the flying public. But he felt compelled by precedent to accept it nevertheless. The examples continue. Banks that contributed to the inaugural committee had litigations against them for violating consumer financial protection laws dropped, and so too did cryptocurrency companies that were investigated and sued by the Securities and Exchange Commission and who contributed to the inaugural committee. Crucially, those crypto companies that did not donate to the committee or other affiliated entities remain defendants of the government. The scale of these frauds involve millions stolen and hundreds killed, and yet they have received a fraction of the attention of the fraud that happened in Minnesota. This concerns me because we are both dismantling our infrastructure for fighting fraud and providing a roadmap for how those fraudsters who are prosecuted can buy their way out of justice. While we need to pursue the fraud we're seeing in Minnesota's social safety programs for all the reasons I said, because it is the weakest among us who are being harmed, we cannot selectively show an interest in fraud. If we do, we put some people, the very powerful and the very rich, beyond the reach of the law. Thank you.
Okay, so there's the introduction into the Minnesota fraud scandal, which is possibly the biggest scandal in American history. As an Australian, we've always been interested in what we believe, well, myself personally as a citizen, I'm sure there's many others, on a parallel level the NDIS scheme in Australia. So I've just put into ChatGPT to help me on this, and this is what we've got. The extent of fraud in the NDIS is an annoying question because the clean numbers mostly don't exist. What we do have are official estimates of leakage, fraud plus non-compliance plus payment error plus small accounts of proven/active fraud cases. The best official, how big is the problem, estimates is billions. Okay, here we go. The Australian National Audit Office reports that in 23 to 24, the NDIA paid out $41.85 billion in NDIS claims. And the NDIA in September 2023 estimated 6 to 10% of outlays could be non-compliant, fraudulent, or incorrect. Now, that translates roughly to 6% of 41.85 billion is 2.5 billion, and 10% of 41.85 billion is 4.2 billion. Not a small amount for a small country. If you do the percentages of that relative to what the United States is dealing with per capita, we are probably in a worse position, an absolutely worse position. So, should there be a Royal Commission into the NDIS? Probably. So, on an NDIA's own estimate, the amount potentially being paid incorrectly is in the low single-digit billions per year. That's billions per year. And that includes fraud, not just fraud. So, ANAO also notes NDIA estimated leakage to 3.5 billion in 2022-23, forecast to rise to 3.6 to 6 billion by 27-28. Again, is attributed to fraud, non-compliance, and errors bundled together. And you can find that in the Australian National Audit Office. So it's not a weak source. Another benchmark, 1.4 billion payment errors, including fraud, in 1 year. ABC News, citing the NDIA annual report at the time, reported an estimated 1.4 billion lost in the prior financial year through payment errors, including fraud and overclaiming. About 4% of the total outlay. That's from the ABC. It also reported the NDIA believed 1.7 billion of those mistaken payments went to NDIS businesses, singling out supported independent living overclaiming, with 2.28 million linked to participant managed plans, not supported by evidence provided. Frustration runs high through NDIS recipients following the above story and from the ABC. Why it's so hard to pin down? It found NDIA claim compliance management only partially effective and says prior to 2024, the NDIS lacked basic prevention controls for fraud and non-compliance. The NDIA's detection processes were reviewing a tiny slice of claims, that's 0.4%, by the dollar value. But in the slice it detected, very high non-compliance was over 50% by the dollar. That's from the Australian National Audit Office. The translation of that is, they're most likely checking where the smoke already is and not checking much of the house. So, I'm going to hand it over to, I think I can hand this over to the reader now, can't I?
ANO also lists the kinds of dodgy claiming they're seeing: ghost participants, claims on expired plans, claims while a participant is incarcerated/hospitalized/overseas long-term, claiming outside the plan, claiming for services not delivered, claiming in advance, overstating/overcharging/duplicate charging, and double-dipping across government programs. What's been found and actioned? The known fraud side. Known fraud cases actually identified, investigated, prosecuted is smaller than the leakage estimates because most fraud isn't discovered immediately. A few solid official data points. Fraud Fusion Task Force, FFT multi-agency. Stats via the Tax Practitioners Board. As of June 30th, 2024, 72 active NDIS fraud cases with an estimated fraud value of $34.5 million. And 16 prosecutions in progress. NDIS says the FFT plus integrity work in 2024 delivered interventions estimated to save $200 million in forecast non-compliant payments, with a further $400 million forecast to be diverted away from dodgy providers. They also reported 26,000 plus tip-offs and identified 15,000 participants potentially impacted by fraudulent providers. NDIS. In one campaign update, NDA said it rejected $86 million worth of claims after combing through 100,000 plus claims, and that 20,000 high-risk claims/month were being reviewed. It also cited 635 plus investigations since November 2022 and 20 successful criminal prosecutions since then. NDIS. Example of organized fraud. AFP reported 3 people jailed over a $5.8 million NDIS fraud, plus ATO/GST elements, involving false claims and false medical reports. AFP also described seizures like cash, gold bullion, crypto, and vehicles. So, what's the extent, in plain English? If you mean how much money might be going out the door wrongly, official NDA estimates cited by ANO put it at 6 to 10% of outlays, billions per year. +1. If you mean how much proven fraud is on the books right now, measured fraud cases are in the tens of millions at a time, plus more under investigation, with enforcement ramping up. +1. If you mean, is this just a few bad apples, ANEO's finding that prevention controls were weak and review coverage was tiny makes it pretty clear the system has been structurally easy to. And yes, it's exploit. And yes, it's possible for both to be true at once. Most providers do the right thing, and a small percentage of a gigantic program still equals billions. Governments love that genre of problem.
So viewers, here's 6 key clues to NDIS fraud. This is dodgy starter pack. Billing for services that didn't happen, number 1. Claims when the participant says they weren't there, didn't receive it, or it's impossible. Same thing as another service. Number 2, the duplicate copy-paste claiming. Same session billed twice, multiple providers claiming for the same time, or identical notes, invoices across days, clients. Number 3, inflated time or pricing. Hours that don't match rosters, shift lengths, suspiciously high admin travels, add-ons, or charging higher rates than allowed. Number 4, claims when the participant couldn't have used the service. Participant is hospitalized, incarcerated, overseas long-term, or otherwise unavailable, but claims keep rolling in like nothing happened. Number 6, services outside the plan or wrong category. Funding used for things not in the participant's plan supports, or creative relabeling to make non-eligible stuff look eligible. And number 6, kickbacks, coercion, or sign here behaviour. Providers offers cash gifts to use them, pressures the participant to hand over login cards, etc. Won't give invoices or blocks access to records. You need to keep an eye on this stuff. This is what's happening across the world in these great big government schemes that are meant to help people, but people are taking advantage of it and wrecking it for everyone. I'll see you on the next one.